Well, I guess that boom and bust, not having sufficient recovery time, understanding his training schedule, because generally, even though athletes often say, oh, I haven't done anything different, when you look back and see what they're doing, often there is a change in that they've either decided to change their technique, or they've done some more paddles, or they've had a competition where they've upped their training, or they've been doing more sprint sessions or whatever. And again, it's not making them vigilant about that. It's just kind of giving them the tools that if your shoulder feels a little bit stiffer or a little bit achy, that they have strategies to counteract that. Because what we really know when we look at these overuse injuries is that generally they seem to relate to fatigue, the compensations we develop in result of that fatigue, and then potentially that just escalates over time. So often by the time somebody's symptomatic, they've been compensating for a long period, and that's not a negative, but it just means, okay, well, let's address the things that you've compensated, get your cuff, scapula, your thoracic rotational a little bit better, but then give you some very simple things to do as part of your recovery that, if you like, keep resetting that system and keeping it healthy.
So you would try and adjust his training a little so that his shoulder's not getting so tired. Is that what you mean by find the
Yeah.
sort of fatigue?
Yeah, well, you kind of, I guess I'm very conscious that what I don't want to do is, if he's got shoulder pain, is let him keep training at the same volume and then add a whole load of exercises in,
Right.
because I'm just going to make him even worse.
Mm.
So if he's saying to me, but Joe, I've got to do the time in the water, well, we can get him putting some fins on, because that'll unload his shoulder. He can still get his time in the water. We might just talk
Okay.
about modifying the amount. So again, I'm always looking at ways of making life easier for the shoulder, and generally that's exaggerating the kinetic chain and, as I say, getting the cuff, scapular muscles doing their job better. But again, I hear the athlete, because if I say stop, that's as bad as, he can't stop, but we can modify his load and we can look at ways of achieving depending on what his goals are. But if you like, it's also an opportunity to educate for the future, because at 45, particularly if he's competed for a long period of time, we know there'll be a slight increase in relative stiffness in that tissue. That's not an issue if he just keeps everything around it doing its job well, and we have those strategies to minimize that accumulation again.
So you mentioned a few things. You mentioned sorry, I thought someone slammed on the door. You mentioned doing some work on the cuff, some work on the scapula, and some work on thoracic rotation. So, I mean, again, for just anyone who doesn't know those terms, could you explain what those are and what it might look like if you're gonna adjust the training volume a little bit, and then you're gonna probably do some exercises to work on those things? What are the kind of things you might be working on?
Yeah, so a lot of the things I use are very simple, and again, I've obviously if this guy's a triathlete, he's likely to be doing stuff in the gym anyway. So for me, often it's just about resetting those foundations, because if you look at swimmers over time, and they often get very stiff in their lats, and they can get in their lat dorsi, the big muscle from their shoulder down to their hip. They can get very stiff in the muscles at both the front and back of their shoulder, but that stiffness is just because of fatigue and that accumulation. So to me, I just do some really simple things. So the rotator cuff, you kind of look at it, that hood we talked about, you've got the front and the back. And interestingly, in swimmers, in a lot of swimmers, it can actually be the front that's relatively weaker compared to the back. So I would have to assess that to identify which was the biggest issue. And then just very simple rotation exercises. But again, I kind of like to build those in with the thorax, so we can just work in 90-90 with some body rotation. We can use TheraBand, we can use weights, but I kind of like to do it with the arm supported to start with, because that makes it all about the rotator cuff. And then when we're working at a reasonable load, then obviously we move to the arm being unsupported. And I also really like weight bearing stuff. So I have exercises where you can be over a gym ball and rolling back and knees up to your chest. A great way of getting weight bearing through range. And weight bearing seems to be a very good way of getting that rotator cuff doing its job together. So it's not just to make it a fun exercise, but obviously you're working the whole of the body in conjunction with the shoulder as well. And so those kind of things are nice warm-up exercises, which are equally very easy to start adding load onto as well. But I guess I'm just in my head thinking, okay, well, let's just get those foundations in terms of emphasize because we know if we look at swimmers in this situation, often they lose a bit of their thoracic rotation, they lose a bit of their flexibility at the shoulder, and doing these very simple exercises often improve that straight away.